other lights. Daniel was captured. He was deported as a young boy from his home in Jerusalem to live his entire life in a foreign country of Babylon. In Psalms 137:4 it says this: "How can we sing a song to the Lord while in a foreign land?" People in exile always have a hard time. A hard time staying close to God when they've been drugged against their will somewhere and into a situation. The book of Daniel teaches us that this world will always be a foreign land. Always be a foreign land for those of us that are followers of Christ. There's a Southern gospel song, and a few of the lyrics came to my mind, and I wrote them down here. And the song says, "This world is not my home. I'm just passing through. My treasures are saved up somewhere beyond the blue. When Jesus beckons me from heaven's open door, and I won't feel at home in this world anymore." As this world puts us through the toils and troubles, as this world puts us through the ringer sometimes, we start taking on some of its characteristics if we're not real careful. It's always trying to drag us from our convictions with God. Our government has tried to do that for so long now that it's just become a part of life that I'm afraid the church is starting to accept. We ought never to accept it. I pray as we study the first 6 chapters of Daniel that we're going to learn how to live with conviction in a world that's full of compromise. Another song that came to my mind, and you guys know I came from a musical background. I had a friend that wrote these lyrics, and I've never forgotten them. His song said, "My word sits there upon your desk, but you love your books and your magazines the best. You prefer the light of your TV as you love the world while you're avoiding me." Those words have dug into my soul my whole entire life. I remember times when I was at low points in Rick's life. And I remember sitting at a big executive desk. And I remember those lyrics coming back through my mind. And I thought, is my word sitting there upon that desk? Am I loving all this other stuff the most? Am I preferring the light of my TV? And I felt I was starting to love the world while I was avoiding Christ. I made a lot of changes in my life at that point, because I had the choice staring down the tubes of me to compromise my faith, be eaten up by the world, and be what people call successful. Or I could stand for what the Lord had trained me to do and not compromise and stand for Him. If this is where you find yourself this morning, you're in good surrounds. I think we've all been there at some point in our life. Here's the question I want you to start to ponder for the morning. How can you live with conviction in an age of compromise? How can you live with conviction in an age that's full of compromise? The lure of compromise is felt by Christians and by non-Christians. Our friend Daniel was invited to compromise his faith on many occasions. His life gives us hope for today and insight for tomorrow. I thought I'd throw in this little story that I read this week. I read this. There was a lady by the name of Karen. Karen was a quality control specialist for a pharmaceutical company. One day, a large order of syringes came in to be tested. And when she tested them in her department, they had contamination on them. And she failed she checked the box, this fails, has to be sent back, has to be done over. And she reported it to her boss. And her boss sat there with a calculator, punching buttons, seeing how much he would lose with that order being turned back, how much the company was going to have to spend to reproduce that order. And then he told Karen to go ahead and sign off on the imperfection, clear the order despite of that contamination. Because of federal legislation, the only person allowed to sign off in this whole company was Karen. No one else was allowed to do it for her. She had to do it. Even with her boss threatening her, she wouldn't budge. This led to a visit by the president of her company. He looked at the cost. He looked at the loss. He looked at the revenue that was going to go away. And then he told her she had to sign. She had the weekend to think about it. And her job was on the line. The part of the story I didn't tell you was that Karen was working hard day and night so that her husband, Andy, could be in seminary at that point in their life. She was their only income. She not only was paying for his schooling, her income was putting bread and butter on the table. She was staring down that gun we call compromise. Their hopes, their dreams, their career paths, everything was in this. You can say all the theological jargon you want to, but it was a choice whether she was going to compromise or whether she was going to stand. Today, I want us to look at, are we going to compromise, or are we going to remain undefiled before God? That couple's predicament was very similar to what God's people faced all through the centuries. There's always pressure on believers to compromise their obedience to God. If you're a true follower of Christ, you can count on facing pressures to compromise your faith. They're there. They're going to be there. Some will be pushed on you by employers, some by family, some by friends. I wrote down some by wolves in sheep's clothing. Internal pressures of trying to get ahead, trying to get that next promotion, trying to get that large contract, trying to get that A on that exam. Pressures confront anyone who seeks to live uncompromisingly for the Lord. So don't think because you're feeling pressure right now that you're all alone. There's nobody in this room that hasn't had pressure from a lot of angles. Been asked plenty of times to water down the truth or to start doing something you don't believe in. In the opening chapter of Daniel, which is what we're going to study, we get to see that he is one of those rare individuals who learned to stand strong for the Lord in the face of very, very real temptations. Things I wanted us to know about Daniel before we even get into the study on Daniel is Daniel's born of a Jewish family of nobility. Okay? Daniel's just not the average kid on the street. He was born into a family of nobility and royalty in Jerusalem, which was his home. They say that as we pick up the story here, and you see the Babylonians taking over Jerusalem, that he was considered to be a young prince in the making there in Jerusalem. His age they've always hypothesized on, but the lowest I've ever heard anybody say was 13. And the oldest I've ever heard anybody say is 18. So Daniel was somewhere in his teens. Those of us in this church can get your head around that by looking at Desi and Walter. That's how old he was. He was a kid trying to do the right thing, but he was still growing, and he was still learning. That's how old Daniel actually was. He had that bright future, being raised in nobility and being told you're going to be the prince and this will all be yours and all of those things. He had been told. And then we see in verse 1 that his city, the city he was raised in, Jerusalem, his home, was attacked by the Babylonians. The Babylonians were merciless about it. The things they know about the Babylonian tactics say they were merciless people when they came to attack your city. When they came to attack, they came to win at all cost. That's what the Babylonians did. So this city that he had grown up in, this city with all his future, all of a sudden the mighty Babylonian army there, and it's under an awful siege. And under the control of Nebuchadnezzar, they said it was a pretty gruesome battle. And the city of Jerusalem was basically flattened off the face of the earth. They beat down buildings, they started fire, they took people captive, and they left. They destroyed his home. We see in verse 2 that not only did they take his home, but we see in verse 2 that Nebuchadnezzar hit the Jewish nation where it hurt. The Jewish nation was a nation following the Lord. The Jewish temples were sacred places. The temples of God were where they gathered and where they worshiped, where their priesthood stayed. Not only did he flatten their city, but it says that he took the articles from that most holy place within the city and took them with him. And he took all of that. He took their sacred worship relics. And that made me think about this. Made me think of that age-old question, why does God let bad things happen to good people? That question boils down to, is God sovereign or is he not? I want to tell you this. When the Babylonians had knocked down that city and got into the temple and got in there and took stuff, God wasn't shocked that it happened. God wasn't wringing his hands saying, what in the world? I'm in despair because they're taking my stuff. He wasn't wondering, how can this happen? In fact, in those verses, it clearly states something that we tend to skate over too often. It says, the Lord who delivered the king of Judah into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. The Lord knew. The Lord let him take those things. Daniel wrote this whole book of the Bible to assure God's people that the Lord is sovereign, to assure God's people that God's always in control, even to those that appear to be in opposition to him. Although we find Daniel in captivity, and he was no longer a prince in the making, he now was a prisoner of war in that enemy country of Babylon. That's when it happened. If you think up till then, Daniel was probably just swimming inside. It doesn't say it was the next day. They had to take him to another place. It took a while. So he had seen his homeland destroyed. He had been separated probably from his family already and taken away by the bad people for some time. And that's when it happened. That unexpected turn of events shows up in our verse 3 and our verse 4. The Babylonian king ordered his chief of staff to train several of the Jewish captives for governmental service. You couldn't have seen that coming. In fact, you would have thought that would be the last thing on earth a Babylonian king would do. He looked down his nose at the Jewish nation. He went and defeated their homeland, beat it, crushed it, and took its people. The last thing on earth you would think he's going to do as his next move is, let's see if we can get some of these guys up to snuff for governmental service. When all that trial was going on in Jerusalem, as that fight was going on in Jerusalem, as Daniel seeing his house burned in Jerusalem, as Daniel sees them taking things out of the sacred temples of Jerusalem, Daniel didn't know that in the future he was going to be asked to be part of the Babylonian kingdom. And here, the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, told his chief of staff to train several of the Jewish captives for government service. He stipulated they had to be of nobility. That limits down the pool pretty quick when you say that. Had to be of nobility. This was Nebuchadnezzar saying this. He said, I want them without any physical defect. That takes a few more out of the pool. Then he says, I want them to be handsome, and I don't know who made the judge call on that. I have no idea. Because everybody has their own idea of what's handsome. Some people think I am. I know one girl that does. They needed to show aptitude for learning. He wanted guys that were well informed. He wanted students that were quick to understand. He wanted them to have the quality to serve in the king's palace, to be taught the language, and to be taught the literature of the Babylonians. Like I say, they estimate that he was about the age of our teens here in our church. And they selected Daniel and 3 of his friends. And they were brought face to face with a test. All he had to do, all Daniel had to do was compromise his obedience to the Almighty God, and he could be a prince again. He could be in the royal house. He could be thought highly of. All those things. He'd receive all that training. For him, I'm sure it would be easy to learn a new language. He was well educated already. He could pass the test. I wrote down here, church, so what will he do? I gave myself 3 endings to this, and I think I'm going to end there for the day. What will he do? Read more of Daniel this week, and you're going to find out what he's going to do. And we're going to talk about it next Sunday. Daniel lived through so many things that I can't even understand. And hopefully I open your eyes the next few weeks to more of Daniel's life and some insights you might not have known. Daniel was a young boy at this part of his life. A young boy that had lost his home. All the things he believed in were crushed and left behind. And he's drugged to that foreign land. And that's where we see him. And he's staring down the question Are you going to live by your convictions? Or are you going to fold? And we're going to pick up there next week, church. So please come back. Bring your friends.